Hey everyone, welcome back to Money Mixology. This is Jason, your host, as always. Today we're continuing the mini series in money mindsets. So far, we've talked about the poverty mindset, and then we covered old money versus new money. For our third episode, we're going to dive into the provider mindset. So, if you happen to catch the radio show I did with Ryan, we sort of touched on this a little bit. The provider mindset, in a nutshell, is best explained by the concept or the term my net worth is my worth. And this is a really dangerous mindset for a number of reasons. Because obviously, we do not want people in our lives to believe that the only value that they bring to the world is the money that they can provide or the income they generate or what their net worth is, that is their own personal worth. We certainly would not want that for our loved ones around us, and yet many of us suffer from it. I mentioned during our intro episode to this series that this mindset is very, very prevalent in the male population. But I also did say it's becoming increasingly popular, if that's the right word. That's kind of a sad way to say it, but it's becoming very prevalent with the female population because now we have so many more females in the workforce at the higher levels as they integrate more deeply into the professional work field. That mindset is going to become more problematic. So, this is an issue that now both genders are beginning to have to deal with at a pretty high rate. And so we want to make sure that we're understanding it. As normal, I want to take a step back and just explain how the mindset is actually playing out. So, someone who's suffering from this concept of my only value to the world is the income or the wealth or the net worth that I can generate kind of idea. If you find someone yourself or someone you know who's having that type of issue, those kinds of concerns, there are often patterns playing out that you can see that this mindset just continues to show out on a daily basis in a number of ways. So, the first one that is, I think, probably pretty self explanatory and becomes easy to understand is that they have a hyper fixation on work. So, for people who believe that their only value in the world is to provide monetary resources to whomever that may be, their family, their job, whoever it is, that I'm only worth what I can generate. And to be clear, this does not have to be just for the family. That's the one that I'm sure you are thinking of in your mind is, let's just say a father who works all the time because he believes that he has to provide for his family. It's the only thing, the only value he provides to the family is the income he generates. That is the most common version of this. But you can also see how this could play out like in a corporate environment where you have someone who, let's say, is in sales and they feel like the only thing that they are worth, the only value they provide at all for their company, to their coworkers, to anybody, is the sales they make. Now, I understand that's technically their job. To be clear, I get it. That is their legitimate value to the organization is to go make sales. But if they start to view themselves as the only thing I'm worth is the sales I can make, that can become a really dangerous mindset. You can also see where it can lead to unethical behavior. Because if that's how you view yourself, I have to produce, whether it's for my family or for my company, I must produce income. And that's the only thing I provide of value. You can see where the unethical behavior can start to bleed out from that. So, this hyper fixation on work is a very, very common concern. It also then becomes, as that fixation on work is maintained over a long enough period of time, if you reach something like retirement, people with the provider mindset often struggle with retirement, with the entire idea of retirement. Because if I retire from my job, from work, if I stop generating income, who am I? What am I? What value do I even provide to my spouse, to my family, to the world? If I'm no longer making income, do I even matter anymore? And you do see post-retirement depression for a lot of folks because they just lose their what they believe to be their purpose. It might not actually be true. They certainly have innate value as a human. Their spouse probably prefers them to be retired so they can spend time with them. But yet, if you've spent your entire life, 40 years of your life believing that income is your value, is your personal value, retirement's going to be really, really tough for you. So this hyper fixation on work doesn't even affect you just during the time that you're working. it will end up affecting you during the time you're trying not to work anymore. And so, the irony there is it kind of never goes away, even though technically the work goes away. A small cousin to this hyperfixation on work, and I think this will be very logical, the next step is burnout. So, people who have the provider mindset, if you're just constantly pushing and pushing and pushing because you believe you must provide more, you must be able to produce more, at some point that can lead you into the danger of burnout. And you can simply reach a point where no matter what you do, you cannot produce anymore. You cannot produce faster. You cannot raise your income anymore. You can't work any more hours in a week, whatever it is. You're going to reach this point of burnout. And it's a very natural outcome of someone who is hyper fixated on the work side. The final part that can be extremely problematic for people with the provider mindset is that they will very often avoid seeking any help. And this can be both with the work side of things, the actual production, the income generation, that kind of thing. But it can also be sort of with their own personal mental health, their personal struggles, whatever needs that they themselves have. Because the mindset can become so strong that if I'm the one everyone is relying on, I'm the cog that makes this machine go, you do not feel you have permission or the ability to step back and take care of yourself. Because if I do that, then who continues to take care of the people I'm responsible for? Who keeps the work going? Who produces the income? And it doesn't matter that from an outsider's perspective, we can all step back and recognize that if they don't take time to take care of themselves, if they don't meet their needs at some point, that's when the burnout will happen. I think we all understand that. The person who's wrapped up in this provider mindset, they'll even be able to acknowledge that and recognize it for other people. They may even be willing to go so far as to acknowledge it for themselves to say, yes, I understand that if I keep going at this pace, I'm going to walk into burnout. So it's one of these interesting dynamics where you can fully understand that what you are suffering from is problematic and that you're potentially headed for something far worse. And yet you still can't overcome it because the mindset can be so deeply embedded. The scripting that's running, the software that's running behind the scenes is so powerful that the fear of not being able to do what you know you're supposed to be doing can be so overwhelming. And I think this is really, really challenging. I mentioned on the radio show episode a couple weeks ago that this is the mindset I personally struggle with the most. And so, as I thought about what to cover for this episode and what to discuss, I have to be perfectly transparent with all of you. This was probably the easiest episode I've ever had to prepare for because this was just telling my story. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily something I should be proud of. I kind of, sort of chuckle about it because it is just the reality of the mindset I personally struggle with. I had a very, very difficult time early in my career. And to some extent, I suppose I do still have flirtations with this difficulty and this mindset of thinking that the only way I was valuable to the people around me was the income that I generated. And I can just be honest with all the listeners out there. The only thing that really broke this mindset for me, at least to some extent, maybe broke its grip on me, I would say, in all fairness, I probably still have this as one of my primary mindsets, but I don't believe it's as debilitating or toxic anymore. And it happened simply because I was at a job that was horrible. And many of my friends and listeners who know me from the show will know exactly which company and job I'm speaking of. It was a job that was literally killing me. My hair was going gray. I was gaining weight. My blood pressure was rising. If I stayed at that job, I was going to have a heart attack. And yet I could not bring myself to break free because I had a good salary and my family desperately relied on me. And the scripting that was running in my mind was if I walk away from this job, I have failed my family. And while I could acknowledge that that made very little sense, that obviously if I die of a heart attack, I've clearly failed my family and they would lose the income anyways since I'd be gone, but I still could not bring myself to pull the trigger. I finally reached a point where it simply just was not tenable anymore. And my wife had a very direct conversation with me that, this is going to kill you if you don't stop doing this. And I think once I was finally able to muster up the strength to walk away from that position and realize the world didn't fall apart, the world did not collapse. And, I was able to find value for myself in just being who I am. That really helped. But not everybody has that option. And I fully recognize that. So I think it's important that we acknowledge that people can be fully aware of the tenuous position they find themselves in and yet unable to break free from it because of how strong this bias can be for people and how important and they believe themselves to be for their family from an income perspective. So we have to be really careful there. The other piece that this provider mindset can also be really problematic and it will show out is something I mentioned on the introduction episode to this series, which is the impact it can unintentionally have on the children. So if you are a father or mother, candidly, I'm speaking from the father's perspective for myself here. If you are a father who highlights everything about your career as the most important thing in the world, that every value you provide to the world is career or money based, then that is the message your children are going to hear. And they are going to internalize that. And I doubt highly that that is what you actually intended as a parent. You did not mean to send the message to your children that the only value they will ever have to the world is what they can provide from a financial perspective. But if you yourself are mirroring that behavior or that mindset, they're going to take it on. They're going to pick it up just like they inherit every other scripting, the way you parent, the teams you root for, all of that. We've said over and over on this show, money does not get its own set of rules. And so if you spend all of your time talking about your religious faith, whatever that may be, your children are very likely going to inherit or pick that up. Well, it's the exact same thing for the way you talk about money and the way you talk about yourself. So if you highlight through your comments, through your actions, whatever it is, that the only value you are is to the family from a bank account perspective, that is what the children are going to hear. And it's going to impact them as they grow up. This was probably at its core the primary reason my wife was able to convince me that to walk away from that position that was bad for me, that was toxic. Because ultimately, as we often do, she called on my parent or she pulled on my parent heartstrings to essentially say, if you keep this up, you're going to show our children that this is okay, that working in a toxic place, that killing yourself for the job is something that's acceptable. And I can't say she used those exact words. My guess is they were much more colorful than what I'm allowed to say on a podcast. But that was the core of the message. And it did get home. And I think many of you listening, who, especially if you have children, would understand. Like if you go after the parent strings, you can get people to move a little bit. They will react more positively when they believe they're benefiting their children. It was important to me that I was able to break that messaging because it was certainly not a message I would want to send to my children. So I think that once we understand the way the provider mindset can bleed out and the way it shows out in our actions, our behaviors, our habits, then we can start to take some positive steps towards a solution or at least a lessening of it. And as I've mentioned, this may never go away. I don't think I will ever not have the provider bias, the provider mindset. I still want to be the core provider for my family. That is still an important part of what I believe in, but it is not, at least not to as large an extent, it's not my core identity anymore. And I think that's an important differentiation. So, a few of the steps that you can take. The first one is you need to create a little bit of margin in your life as best you can. And I mean financial margin in sort of the most literal sense of what we mean by margin. You need to have a buffer of financials so that you are not mentally always up against the line. If you have enough resources, you've done the proper budgeting, the proper savings, you have an emergency fund, you've taken the appropriate steps that we always preach as financial planners, and you have built some cushion, which is what margin is, if you've built that cushion, that little bit of spare space into your financial life, then you as the provider will not be under the immense self-inflicted pressure to always provide, to always keep the boogeyman at bay. If you know that, hey, I can take a 2-week vacation, maybe miss a paycheck here or there, not have to work instead of working 30 hours at my second job, I can work 10 hours. If you know that that's not going to collapse the finances of the family, then you've just given yourself a little more breathing room to be able to back down from that excessive work, that hyper-fixation, and to come off of the burnout line. And so I think that's the first piece that's really important, and it requires the good strategic budgeting and planning and things like that, so you can get off the red line and not feel the pressure to constantly walk the tightrope. The second thing I would suggest you do is something that sounds hokey, but I promise it does work, which is to do a worth inventory. Because the messaging you've been living under is that my net worth is my worth. And you must break that equation in a very literal sense. So, on what you're going to do is you are going to produce a sheet of paper with two lists, two columns. The left column is the financial worth you bring to the family. So, or to the industry, the community, whatever you're struggling, typically the family. So, you're going to say my income, right? My budgeting skills, my net worth, the actual balance sheet money I have, whatever it is, my retirement plan, whatever you want to put on that side of the equation, all the things that you've constantly thought of as your worth. The second column is the important one. This is where you're going to put your worth in every other way. So it can be role model to your children. It can be positive partner to your spouse. It can be good friend to your buddies at the gym. It can be whatever you feel like is something that is positive that you bring to the world, and not just your family, to the entire world, everybody around you. What are the positive things you bring that are not money related? Because it is important you begin to recognize those. And you need to understand that you are a far more holistic human being than just a paycheck. And so you must identify those things on a piece of paper with clearly articulated so that you can really see it and internalize it over time. I repeat, I understand this sounds hokey. I get it, but it does work. It does start to show you that you are more than just a paycheck. The third thing that I would suggest you do is look at shifting your mindset from provider to steward and understanding. And I'll use myself as an example, somebody who's clearly heavily steeped in the finance world. My real job, my teaching job, everything, this podcast, it's all finance, it's all money. And so what I need to do is shift my brain away from just being a provider and more towards being the steward of my family and thinking of myself in the terms of it's not my sole responsibility to provide everything for everyone, to be the only thing keeping the machine running. That is not at all what my job is. It's not what I'm supposed to be doing. It's not the way my wife views me. It's not the way my children view me. That is not reality. What is reality is that I am responsible to those folks to be a good steward of our resources, to be someone who is responsible for maintaining our family's well being. That is a very, very different mindset than simply being the income generation machine. And so I'm not an ATM, right? That is, you have to break away from that and start to view yourself in a much more positive and factually correct view, which is that you're responsible for a far larger picture than you're giving yourself credit for. And viewing yourself as a steward, as the person whose job is to shepherd the entire family's well being forward, gives you permission to account for and bring into consideration these other areas. For example, your own mental health. You have to understand that if I'm going to be responsible for maintaining my family's financial strength, my family's solid foundation moving forward, I have to be whole. Personally have to be in a position where I can stand on my own 2 feet, where I'm not falling apart. Because if I'm falling apart, I'm actually disrespecting the role I'm supposed to be playing as the shepherd or as the steward of the family. So I think that that's really, really important. This would play out in a similar situation if you had a mother who's really struggling with, I must do absolutely everything for my kids. I have to be there for everything. I have to be their whole world. That's not what you're being asked to do. You're being asked to steward those children into adulthood. So if you, as a parent, are not allowing yourself to have any needs taken care of, if you're allowing your own mental health to deteriorate, you are actually just doing a disservice to the children. And so it is backwards of reality. The way you're viewing it is backwards. So if you can start to shift your mindset to say, I must steward the family forward, and that includes myself as part of that family, it's a much healthier mindset. The last suggestion I would throw out there is get some freaking hobbies. Just go out there and actually have some fun. Do something that is different. Get away from work, because this will become extra important when you finally reach the stage of retirement. And Brian and I spoke about this on the radio show. The critical comment here is don't retire from something, retire to something. So instead of retiring from your job, I'm retiring to my woodworking and my working out and my traveling and spending time with my grandkids or my kids, all of the various things you want to do in the world. If you have those hobbies, then you will no longer define yourself by your paycheck. There's no reason to. You can define yourself as a woodworker, as a world explorer, as grandpa, as whatever, fill in the blank, car racer, whatever it may be. And so by doing that, I think it gives you an ability to look at yourself much more holistically. So start getting out and exploring those different hobbies and doing something different to show yourself that you can be far more well-rounded than just the ATM machine. That's it for today's episode. It's obviously a very personal episode for me, but I think it's important because so many people struggle with this concept. And I think it's just adamantly important that we take a moment to think through and recognize how intrinsically valuable we are to the people around us in ways that have absolutely nothing at all to do with money whatsoever. Even though this is a money podcast, there's far more important things out there than the finances. And ultimately, if you are not convinced of that, just ask them. I promise you, if you ask your family what value, what worth you bring to their life, the odds of the answer being money are very, very low. They are not going to answer with that. They do not care about that. That's a secondary feature. And so hearing that can be really powerful. So if you don't believe me, ask your family. They will give you the answer you're looking for. So I appreciate your time. As always, please stay tuned for the last episode in the series when we're going to talk about extreme privacy mindset. I hope you enjoy. Everyone have a wonderful day, and thanks for joining us.